some work to do with you, Morgan. Listen to me. Pay attention, you people. I had a young friend who she said she wants to be a pastor because then people would have to listen to her. But what's your response when you hear that? Are you like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll listen? Well, if you're like me, not that I'm any little bit contrary or anything, but my response would be, yeah, no thank you. But that's how Isaiah opens this passage. He didn't want to be a prophet. He didn't feel like he was adequate to the task. We read about his call in Isaiah 6. But eventually, usually, God has God's way, and Isaiah became a prophet. I can relate to that a little bit, because I really did not want to be a pastor. I perceived my call in 1999. I know exactly where I was, exactly the day it was. I say perceived my call because once I perceived it and then looked back on my life, I could see places where probably that call was there and I just couldn't or wouldn't or didn't want to hear it at that time. But Isaiah says, the Lord called me before my birth, called my name when I was in my mother's womb. I am what one of my seminary professors called a crock-pot thinker. Things kind of have to work a little more slowly. So who is this servant that's being called here that Isaiah points us to? First, it's identified as Isaiah. Within the Christian tradition, we interpret it as Jesus. That's the one, ultimately, that we see Isaiah pointing to. But I want to posit to you today that yes, it is Isaiah. Yes, it is Jesus. But then it goes even beyond Jesus to you and me. We are called. Isaiah couldn't believe his call. He says, mourn for me, I'm ruined. Again, I can relate. I was looking for a job like I had, living in Kansas making California wages. Not quite what I got. So for years, I did deny my call. Perhaps you can relate to that. And this call, it's more than just a call to personal devotion. It is a call to that, don't get me wrong, but it's more than that. In a few weeks, next week, we're going to be starting a 3-week series on Thank God I'm a Methodist. So we'll talk a little bit about what that personal devotion and social devotion means. So come back, please. So God calls us. God calls all of us. And those whom God calls, I learned long ago, God equips. God doesn't call the equipped, but God equips those whom God calls. Isaiah said, God made my mouth like a sharp sword and hid me in the shadow of God's own hand. God made me a sharpened arrow and concealed me in God's quiver. God gives us the abilities to do the tasks to which God calls us, shaping us and sharpening us, like Isaiah. So what's a called person to do with this call? I believe part of our call is to restoration and reconciliation. Isaiah said, and now the Lord, this is the same God who called Isaiah even before he was born, the Lord has decided to restore Jacob to God so that Israel might return to him. As Susan mentioned in her opening to the scriptures, the Israelites have been exiled to Babylon, and Isaiah has been called to preach to them there, that they are to return from exile. we have that same call. I'm guessing that you can name at least one or two, maybe a handful of people who are exiled from our congregation. We're called to bring back those who have wandered from the flock. But that's not all. Our reading's not done. No, if we continue on, God says it's not enough to raise up the tribes of Jacob and bring back the survivors of Israel. No, it's not just the house of Israel. Not just those whom we already know who are members of our congregation. It's also to those who don't know God, who don't have a relationship with any congregation. Isaiah says, I also appoint you as a light to the nations. That sounds like pretty much everybody to me. A light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew he couldn't stop working with just for civil rights for African Americans in the U.S. He knew he had to take it wider. He didn't get that chance. Because he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So it doesn't matter who we're talking about, who that non-knowing group is, immigrant workers, the working poor, members of the LGBT community, especially transgendered females of color. In some places, anyone oppressed in any way is who we are called to reach out to in Christian love. Until we look at people and see people first and not a member of some group or another, we are much more alike than we are different. And we are all loved and cherished by God. So I am called, you are called, each and every one of us is called. As the psalm said, we are the ones God lifted from the pit, from the mud and the filth. We are the ones whom God set on solid ground. We are the ones whom God gave a new song. We are the ones for whom God did so many wonderful things, more than we can count. We are the one that God gave ears to hear. We are the ones to whom God says, I want to do your will. In our opening hymn, we affirm that we are called to be light for the kingdom, hope for the hopeless. We're called to act with justice, to love tenderly, to serve one another. The Sunday school class this morning would add to that last line, and to walk humbly with our God. Isaiah says it's not enough just to bring back to the church those who have drifted away. We are called, Isaiah says, appointed. We are appointed as a light to the nations, to all people, so that God's salvation, God's deliverance, redemption, God's justice may reach to the ends of the earth. So contrary to my young friend's belief, you don't need to be a pastor to preach. And you don't need a preacher for people to listen to you. You, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. You are called. And because you're called, God will equip you with whatever it is that you need to do the task to which God is called. You are called. Do you perceive it? Will you embrace it? And trust that the God who calls you is big enough to equip you. And yes, to use even us mortal beings, flawed as we are. God's strength, God's call is enough. Thanks be to God. Let us join now together in affirming that which we believe. We believe